He called his pregnant wife his greatest regret in front of everyone. A woman he was supposed to love and cherish, reduced to a mistake over a cold dinner. But while the millionaire husband, Gideon Thorne, slept soundly in his mansion, his wife, Rosalind, was making a move that would shatter his world. By the time the sun rose, she wasn't just the woman he'd humiliated. She was the new CEO of his entire empire. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of how one woman's heartbreak became her greatest weapon, and how she took everything, leaving him with only his regret. The dining room at the Thorne estate was designed to intimidate. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror, shine reflected the cold light of a crystal chandelier that dripped from the ceiling like a frozen waterfall. 20 guests, the crème de la crème of New York's financial elite, sat around it, their laughter sounding brittle and sharp in the cavernous space. This was Gideon Thorne's kingdom, and they were his court. At the head of the table he presided. Gideon was a man carved from ambition and success, with a jawline as sharp as his business acumen and eyes the color of faded currency. He was a millionaire many times over the founder of Thorne Industries, a sprawling tech conglomerate that had its tendrils in everything from satellite communications to private data. Opposite him, at the foot of the table, sat his wife, Rosalind. To the casual observer, she was the perfect accessory to his power, beautiful, elegant, with a serene smile that never quite reached her eyes. Tonight, she wore an emerald green gown that flowed over her 7-month pregnancy bump, a visible symbol of the dynasty Gideon was so intent on building. But beneath the silken smiles, Rosalind felt like a ghost at the feast. The dinner was in honor of an impending merger, a deal that would make Gideon not just a millionaire, but a billionaire. The air was thick with sycophantic praise and the clinking of expensive wine glasses. Rosalind picked at her food, the scent of truffle oil and roasted quail turning her stomach. The baby was restless, kicking against her ribs as if sensing her unease. And of course, none of this would be possible without the right partner. One of the investors, a slick man named Cormac Riley, said, raising his glass to Gideon, "To a man who knows how to pick a winner in business and in life." A polite murmur of agreement went around the table. Gideon acknowledged the toast with a tight, self-satisfied smile. His gaze swept the room, landing finally on Rosalind. There was no warmth in it, only a cool assessment, as if he were evaluating a stock that had underperformed. Rosalind offered a small, hopeful smile back. Perhaps this was the moment. Perhaps in front of all these important people, he would say something kind, something loving. He had been so distant lately, consumed by the merger, speaking to her only in clipped sentences about schedules and appearances. The pregnancy which had initially thrilled him now seemed to be an inconvenience he barely acknowledged. An older woman seated to Rosalind's right, the wife of a board member, leaned in conspiratorially. "You must be so proud, dear," she whispered, her voice laced with a cloying sweetness. "To have snagged a man like Gideon, and a baby on the way. You've secured your future." Rosalind's smile faltered. Secured her future. Was that what this was? A transaction? She thought of the man she'd fallen in love with 5 years ago. A man with a fire in his eyes who spoke of changing the world, not just owning it. He had courted her with poetry and late-night conversations, not balance sheets and stock options. She, with her quiet intelligence and a degree in forensic accounting she'd set aside, had been drawn to his passion, believing she could be a true partner to him. Now she felt like little more than a line item in his grand ledger of assets. The conversation shifted to legacy. Cormac, lubricated by his fourth glass of wine, turned his attention to Rosalind. Well, Rosalind, the next generation of Thorn, Gideon must be thrilled. A boy, I hope. To carry on the name. Before Rosalind could answer, Gideon spoke from the head of the table. His voice cut through the chatter like a shard of glass. Actually, Cormac. He began, a strange, cruel smirk playing on his lips. We were just discussing regrets earlier today. The table fell silent. Every eye turned to Gideon. He savored the attention a performer in his own private theater. Rosalind's heart began to beat, a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She could feel a cold dread seeping into her bones. I was saying, Gideon continued, his eyes locking onto Rosalind's, pinning her in place. That my greatest regret was rushing into things, making a permanent decision based on a temporary feeling. He let the words hang in the air, heavy and poisonous. The meaning was unmistakable. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Glances were exchanged. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating. Rosalind felt the blood drain from her face. The room seemed to tilt, the faces of the guests blurring into grotesque masks of pity and morbid curiosity. He was talking about her, about their marriage, about their unborn child. You see, Gideon went on, his voice casual, as if he were discussing a minor business miscalculation. In my line of work, you have to be ruthless. You cut away the fat, the parts of the portfolio that are underperforming. You don't hold on out of sentimentality. It's a lesson that applies everywhere. You can't let a mistake define your future. A mistake. The word echoed in the ringing silence of the room. He had just called her and their child a mistake. In front of 20 people whose opinions he valued more than hers, he had stripped her of her dignity, her worth, her love, and reduced her to an error on his life's otherwise perfect record. The air she was breathing felt thin, sharp. The baby kicked again, a hard, insistent jab as if in protest. For a split second, she thought she might be sick right there on the pristine white tablecloth. She looked at Gideon, pleading with her eyes for him to stop, to take it back, to laugh and say it was some kind of twisted joke. But he just stared back, his expression cold, triumphant. He had asserted his power, reminded everyone in the room who he was and what mattered to him. His company, his deal, his legacy. And she was just a disposable part of it. Slowly, deliberately, Rosalind placed her napkin on the table. The sound of the linen hitting the wood was deafening in the silence. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping against the marble floor. Her movements were graceful, measured, betraying none of the seismic shock that was tearing through her. She stood up, her back straight, her chin high. She didn't look at the pitying faces of the guests. She didn't look at the smirking face of Cormac Riley. She looked only at her husband. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "I suddenly feel quite unwell." Without another word, she turned and walked out of the dining room. Her steps were even. Her posture was perfect. She did not run. She did not cry. She walked through the grand foyer, past the silent watching portraits of Thorn ancestors, and out into the cold, unforgiving night, the word regret branding itself onto her soul. But as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, the shock began to recede, replaced by a clarity as cold and sharp as the winter air. Gideon had made a mistake, all right, but it wasn't marrying her. It was underestimating her. The drive back to their city penthouse was a blur of streetlights and tears. Rosalind didn't bother with the chauffeur. She got into her own car, a modest sedan Gideon had always sneered at, and drove through the glittering, indifferent streets of Manhattan. The city lights, usually a source of comfort, seemed to mock her, each one a tiny spotlight on her humiliation. She didn't cry loud, racking sobs. Hers were silent, hot tears that tracked down her cheeks and dripped onto the lap of her emerald gown. Each tear was for a different betrayal. One for the man she thought she had married. One for the public degradation. One for the innocent child in her womb, who had been dismissed as a liability before it had even drawn its first breath. When she reached the penthouse, a sterile expanse of glass, steel, and white leather that had never felt like home, the silence was absolute. She walked through the vast living room, her heels clicking on the imported Italian marble. On the wall was a massive abstract painting Gideon had bought at auction, a chaotic splash of black and red. Tonight it looked like a portrait of her own heart. For an hour, she allowed herself to crumble. She curled up on a sofa that cost more than her parents' first house, and let the pain wash over her. She thought of Gideon's words, turning them over and over in her mind. Regret. Mistake. Underperforming. He had spoken of her as if she were a failing stock to be divested. He hadn't seen a wife, a partner, the mother of his child. He had seen an entry in a ledger, and it was in the red. The initial shock gave way to a profound, hollow ache. This wasn't a sudden crack in their marriage. It was the final, shattering confirmation of what she had been refusing to see for months. The late nights he claimed were for work. The dismissive wave of his hand when she tried to discuss their future, the way his eyes would glaze over when she talked about the baby. It was all there. She had just been too in love, too hopeful to read the signs. As the city's hum vibrated through the floor-to-ceiling windows, something inside her shifted. The ache began to harden, the sorrow crystallizing into a cold, hard diamond of rage. He wanted to talk about portfolios and assets. Fine. Let's talk about assets. Rosalind pushed herself off the sofa. She walked into Gideon's home office, a room she rarely entered. It was his sanctuary, a testament to his ego. One wall was covered in framed magazine covers featuring his face. Titan of tech, the man who built tomorrow, the Thorn touch. She ignored them. Her eyes scanned the bookshelf filled with leather-bound first editions he'd never read. She wasn't looking for a book. She was looking for a safe. She found it behind a false panel, a state-of-the-art biometric safe that supposedly only Gideon could open. He was wrong. Rosalind placed her hand on the cool metal, then leaned in close, her breath fogging the surface. Voice authentication required a synthesized female voice announced. She took a deep breath. The world is a stage, and we are merely players. She said, her voice clear and steady. It was the password they had set together years ago on a trip to London after seeing a Shakespeare play. It felt like a lifetime ago. A green light flickered. Retinal scan required, the voice continued. Rosalind leaned in her eye, aligning with the scanner. When they had first installed the safe, Gideon had insisted on adding her biometrics. Just in case, my love, he'd said, kissing her hair. Everything I have is yours. Another lie, but a useful one. With a soft thump, the heavy door of the safe unlatched. Inside, past the stacks of bearer bonds and the deeds to foreign properties, was what she was looking for, a simple black ledger. And next to it, a sleek encrypted hard drive. This was Gideon's real legacy. Not the one he paraded in magazines, but the one built in the shadows. Her father, a man named Philip, had been a forensic accountant, a quiet, meticulous man who believed numbers never lied. When Rosalind had announced her engagement to the dazzling Gideon Thorne, her father had been wary. He didn't trust charm. He trusted balance sheets. "Let me just take a look, Rosie," he had said gently, "for my own peace of mind. Let me see the foundation of the house you're about to live in." To appease him, and with a younger, more naive Gideon's permission, she and her father had spent a week poring over the financials of Thorne Industries. Her father had taught her how to read between the lines, to see the stories hidden in the figures. And they had found a story, a very ugly one. They discovered a pattern of sophisticated, deeply unethical accounting, a scheme to systematically undervalue liabilities and inflate assets, all designed to make the company look far healthier than it was, especially to potential investors or acquisition partners. It wasn't just aggressive, it was fraudulent. Her father had compiled his findings into a detailed report, a step-by-step guide to Gideon's financial sins, and saved it onto this encrypted drive. "This is a loaded gun, Rosie," her father had warned, his face grim. "A man who builds his house on a rotten foundation will do anything to keep it from collapsing. Be careful." At the time, Rosalind had been horrified. She'd confronted Gideon, who had masterfully explained it away as standard creative accounting, a necessary evil to compete in a cutthroat world. He had promised her he would clean it up, that it was a relic of his early, hungrier days. She, blinded by love, and his charisma, had believed him. She had put the drive and the ledger in the safe and tried to forget. Now his words from dinner came back to her. "You cut away the fat. You don't hold on out of sentimentality." He had taught her the rules of his world. Tonight, she would finally play his game. She took the ledger and the hard drive from the safe. She walked back into the living room and sat at the large glass dining table. She opened her laptop, its humble plastic shell a stark contrast to Gideon's sleek tech empire. She plugged in the hard drive. Her father's report bloomed on the screen. Columns of figures highlighted discrepancies, footnotes detailing hidden shell corporations and deferred expenses that were in reality massive ticking time bombs of debt. The most damning evidence related directly to the current merger. Gideon had hidden a colossal liability from a failed satellite launch, burying it so deep in a subsidiary's books that only a forensic accountant with a bloodhound's nose could find it. If the acquiring company, a German conglomerate called Arion AG, discovered this, the deal wouldn't just collapse Gideon, and his board would be facing shareholder lawsuits, SEC investigations, and potentially prison. Rosalind's fingers flew across the keyboard. Her degree, dormant for 5 years, came roaring back to life. The grief that had paralyzed her was gone, replaced by a laser-like focus. She wasn't just a scorned wife anymore. She was an architect of Gideon's downfall and her own ascent. She began drafting an email. She cross-referenced the names in her father's ledger with the current board members of Thorne Industries. The names lit up in her memory. Cormac Riley, the sycophant at dinner. Beatrice Croft, the icy chairwoman. Frank Gable, the aging CFO, who was nearing retirement. They were all complicit. They had all signed off on the fraudulent financials. They all had just as much to lose as Gideon. The plan formed in her mind, sharp and perfect. She wouldn't leak this to the press or the SEC. That would destroy the company, and with it, her child's future security. She wouldn't just take revenge. She would take control. She would use the very weapon Gideon had unknowingly handed her, his own corruption, to stage a coup. The clock on the wall read 1:00 a.m. Gideon would be driving back soon, drunk on wine and arrogance, probably expecting her to be in bed weeping. He couldn't be more wrong. The weeping woman was gone. In her place was a CEO in waiting, and her first board meeting was about to begin. Rosalind knew she couldn't afford a single misstep. Gideon was a shark. He could smell blood in the water from a mile away. Her attack had to be swift, precise, and leave him with no room to maneuver. Her weapon was the information on the hard drive, but her strategy had to be flawless. Her target wasn't Gideon. Not yet. Her targets were the members of his board. She knew them not just as names on a corporate masthead, but as people. She had sat through countless charity galas, boring yacht parties and tense holiday dinners with them. She had observed their weaknesses, their vanities, their fears. While Gideon had seen her as a decorative object, she had been watching, listening, and learning. First on her list was Frank Gable, the chief financial officer. Frank was old school, a man in his late 60s who had been with Gideon from the beginning. He was loyal, but he was also terrified. His entire life was built around his reputation as a prudent, unimpeachable numbers man. His pension, his legacy, it was all tied up in Thorn Industries. He was also, as her father's notes meticulously detailed, the primary architect of the accounting fraud, the one who had made Gideon's creative ideas a reality on the balance sheets. He had the most to lose professionally. At 1:45 a.m., she called his private cell phone. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "Who is this? Frank, it's Rosalind Thorne," she said, her voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the late hour. Silence. Then a sputtering, "Rosalind, is everything all right? I was so sorry about what happened at dinner. Gideon was out of line." What Gideon said was a symptom, Frank. "The disease is what I'm calling about," she said, letting the cryptic statement hang in the air. She didn't wait for him to respond. "I'm looking at a report. It details a significant unbooked liability concerning the QS-7 satellite failure. A liability that seems to have been deliberately obfuscated in the financials presented to Erion AG. Your signature is on those financials." The silence on the other end of the line was no longer sleepy. It was petrified. She could hear his breathing ragged and quick. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but the lie was thin and brittle. "Don't you, Frank?" Rosalind's voice was soft, almost sympathetic. "My father was Philip Adler. I don't know if you remember him, but he was a forensic accountant. A very, very good one. He taught me to read a balance sheet like a confession. And this one tells me that you, Gideon, and the rest of the board are about to commit securities fraud on an international scale." She heard a gasp, a choked sound of pure panic. "I have a complete, itemized breakdown of the scheme," she continued, her tone hardening slightly. "A file I can send to the lead counsel at Erion AG, the SEC, and the Wall Street Journal with a single click, or you can help me fix it." "Fix it? What do you mean?" Frank whispered, his voice trembling. "The deal closes in 3 days. If we restate earnings now, the merger is dead. We're all ruined." "The merger is dead if this information gets out, Frank. But the company doesn't have to be. Gideon's leadership has become erratic and reckless. His behavior tonight was just the tip of the iceberg. His judgment is compromised. The board has a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the shareholders, to protect the company." She let the implication sink in. She was offering him a way out, a coup disguised as a rescue mission. What do you want? He finally asked, the fight gone from his voice. I want an emergency board meeting convened via teleconference at 6:00 a.m. sharp. I want a vote of no confidence in Gideon. I want him placed on an immediate indefinite leave of absence pending an internal investigation. And I want an interim CEO appointed to stabilize the company and renegotiate the terms of the merger from a position of honesty. An interim CEO who, me, Rosalind said simply. There was a long pause. She could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the panic, the calculation, the dawning realization that she was his only lifeline. A disgraced wife was a far better alternative than a federal indictment. I'll make the calls, he said, his voice a dry rasp. They'll be on the line at 6. 1 down, 4 to go. Next was Beatrice Croft, the chairwoman of the board. Beatrice was a formidable woman in her 50s, known for her icy demeanor and corporate savvy. She had no sentimental loyalty to Gideon. Her loyalty was to power and money. Her weakness, as Rosalind knew from overhearing a hushed conversation at a disastrous Hamptons weekend, was a secret side deal she had structured with Cormac Riley to personally profit from the Aryan merger, a clear conflict of interest that would get her barred from every boardroom in the country. Rosalind didn't call Beatrice. She sent her an email at 2:30 a.m. The subject line was simple: Cayman Islands, account 74B. The body of the email was even simpler. It contained a single scanned page from her father's ledger, showing the flow of funds from a Thorn Industries subsidiary into a shell corporation that Beatrice and Cormac controlled. Below it, Rosalind wrote 6:00 a.m. Teleconference. Frank Gable is sending the details. Be there. We are saving the company from Gideon. The response came back in less than 90 seconds. I'll be there. Third was Cormac Riley himself, the man who had toasted Gideon's brilliance just hours earlier. Cormac was an opportunist, a jackal who fed on the kills of lions like Gideon. He was ambitious and utterly ruthless. His loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder or to the person with the most leverage. Rosalind had just proven to his co-conspirator Beatrice that she had that leverage. She knew Beatrice would call him immediately, their panicked conversation cementing their decision. They would fall in line together. The final 2 board members were easier. They were older, more passive, their seats largely ceremonial. They followed the lead of the power players like Frank and Beatrice. Once Frank called them, invoking an emergency and citing unspecified legal exposure, they would agree. Fear was contagious. By 4:00 a.m., the pieces were in place. Rosalind had become a ghost in the machine of Thorn Industries, pulling levers and flipping switches from the sterile silence of Gideon's penthouse. She had turned his own board, his hand-picked council of allies, against him. She leaned back, her body thrumming with adrenaline. The baby gave a gentle flutter inside her, as if it knew, as if it was proud. She placed a hand on her stomach. It's for you, she whispered, so no one can ever call you a regret. She looked at the clock. 4:15 a.m. Gideon would be home soon. She needed to be gone before he arrived. She packed a small overnight bag with essentials. Then she walked back into his office. She looked at the safe, now closed. He would have no idea she had been inside. Her final move was the most personal. She took her wedding and engagement rings off. They felt cold and foreign on her skin. She didn't throw them. She placed them carefully on the center of his desk, right on top of his favorite magazine cover, the one that declared him the man who built tomorrow. Let him build it alone. As she walked out of the penthouse, the first hints of dawn were beginning to streak the sky over the East River. It was a new day, and by the time the sun was fully risen, it would be her company. The conference call began at 6:00 a.m. on the dot. Rosalind sat in a small anonymous hotel room she had checked into under her maiden name, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. Her laptop was open, 5 names glowing on the screen. Frank Gable, Beatrice Croft, Cormac Riley, and the 2 other board members, a retired general and a tech professor. They were the architects of Gideon's kingdom, and she was about to burn their king. Frank Gable, his voice strained and formal, opened the meeting. "Thank you for joining on such short notice. Due to extraordinary and sensitive circumstances that pose an imminent and material threat to the company, this emergency session of the board has been convened." "What the hell is this?" Frank Cormac Riley's voice boomed through the speakers, full of false bravado. "I was at dinner with Gideon last night. Everything was fine." Beatrice Croft, ever the pragmatist, cut him off. Her tone was like ice. "Clearly it wasn't. Let's not waste time. Frank, state the purpose of the meeting." Frank faltered. For a second, Rosalind worried he would lose his nerve. She unmuted her microphone. "I believe I can clarify," Rosalind said. Her voice, calm and measured, filled the digital space. There was a collective intake of breath. Rosalind Beatrice said, her surprise evident. "What is the meaning of this?" "This is a board meeting." "It is," Rosalind agreed. "And as the person who holds the key to either the survival or the complete implosion of this company, I believe I have a right to be here." "Don't you?" She let the threat hang there unspoken, but perfectly understood by the 3 key players. Frank, Beatrice, and Cormac knew exactly what she meant. The 2 other members were audibly confused. Implosion. "What is she talking about?" the general asked. "She's talking about leverage," Beatrice said, her voice clipped. She had clearly decided to take control of the narrative, to frame this as a proactive move on their part, not a capitulation to blackmail. "Frank and I have been made aware of certain accounting irregularities concerning the Arion merger, irregularities that Gideon personally directed. His recent erratic behavior, which I'm sure we all witnessed last night, has put this entire company at risk. He has become a liability." Cormac, seeing which way the wind was blowing, immediately changed his tune. "She's right. His conduct was appalling. Unstable. Not the man we know. He's jeopardizing the deal of a lifetime. It was a masterful performance of self-preservation. They were already distancing themselves, painting Gideon as a rogue agent. The liability is significant enough to not only scuttle the merger, but to trigger a full-scale SEC investigation and shareholder litigation that would bankrupt us all." Rosalind stated, her voice devoid of emotion. She was merely stating facts. "However, I believe the damage can be contained, but not with Gideon at the helm." Frank Gable cleared his throat, finding his courage now that the Rubicon had been crossed. "The motion on the table is twofold. First, a vote of no confidence in CEO Gideon Thorne, placing him on immediate and indefinite leave of absence, effective immediately. Second, the appointment of an interim CEO to manage this crisis." "And who do you propose?" the professor asked. "Rosalind Thorne," Beatrice said without missing a beat. A stunned silence followed. The professor finally broke it. "His wife. With all due respect, this is highly irregular. She has no executive experience. She has a degree in forensic accounting," Rosalind said, speaking for herself. "And more importantly, I am the only one who fully understands the depth of this problem and possesses the evidence to prove it. The German regulators at Arion will need reassurance. They will need to see that the company is taking this seriously, that it has cleaned house and put someone in charge who will be transparent. Who better than the person who uncovered the rot in the first place? You can present me as a whistleblower, a reformer. It's a narrative that works. She was giving them the script, showing them how to spin this to their advantage. And if we refuse, the general grumbled a final weak protest. If you refuse. Rosalind, said her voice, dropping to an icy whisper, this call will end. My next call will be to the lead prosecutor at the Southern District of New York. I will hand them the encrypted drive, the ledger, and the full recording of this conversation. Your reputations will be destroyed by lunchtime. Your assets will be frozen by dinner. Frank, you'll likely be denied bail. Beatrice and Cormac, your side deal in the Caymans will make you the poster children for corporate greed. Do you really want to find out what happens next? The threat was so stark, so brutal, that no one dared to speak. The choice was clear, a humiliating but survivable coup, or total annihilation. All in favor of the motion to place Gideon Thorne on leave. Frank asked, his voice shaking. I said Beatrice. I said Cormac. I, the general muttered reluctantly. I, the professor, conceded. I, Frank, said, the motion carries. Gideon Thorne is hereby relieved of his duties as CEO. Rosalind felt a tremor pass through her, a mixture of terror and exhilaration. It was done, and all in favor of appointing Rosalind Thorne as interim CEO. Frank continued. The eyes came quicker this time. They had already crossed the line. There was no turning back. The motion carries, Frank declared, his voice heavy with the weight of his betrayal. Effective immediately. Rosalind Thorne is the interim chief executive officer of Thorne Industries. Rosalind took a slow, deep breath. Thank you, board members. You have made the right decision for the company. My first official act is to freeze Gideon's corporate accounts and revoke his access to all company property, effective immediately. Frank, see to it. My second is to schedule a meeting with the executive team for 9:00 a.m. in the main conference room. I'll be there. That is all. She disconnected the call before they could respond, leaving them in the wreckage of the company they had built. She looked out the hotel window. The sun was now fully above the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city. It was morning, and she was CEO. Gideon Thorne woke up with a pounding headache and the sour taste of expensive wine in his mouth. He rolled over in the massive bed, reaching for Rosalind. His hand met only cold, empty sheets. He sat up annoyed. She was probably sulking in one of the guest rooms. He'd been harsh last night, he knew that. But it was necessary. People needed to be reminded of who was in charge of the natural order of things. She had been getting too comfortable starting to voice opinions on his business, on their life, as if they were equals. The pregnancy had made her emotional soft. He needed to re-establish the boundaries. She'd get over it. She always did. He showered, dressed in a custom-tailored suit, and went downstairs expecting to find coffee brewed and his driver waiting. The penthouse was eerily silent. A flicker of unease went through him. On his desk in the office, he saw her rings, sitting like two small golden eyes, accusing him. It wasn't a sulk. This was a statement. He scoffed. It was overly dramatic, but she'd be back. Where would she go? He owned this world, and she just lived in it. He took his own sports car from the garage, roaring down the FDR Drive towards the Thorne Industries Tower in Midtown. He felt a surge of power as the gleaming glass and steel building came into view. His name emblazoned at the top in bold silver letters. This was real. This was what mattered. He swiped his keycard at the executive parking garage entrance. The light flashed red. Access denied. He frowned, irritated. A glitch in the system. He swiped it again. Access denied. He cursed and parked on the street, striding into the main lobby. The security guard, a man who had greeted him by name every day, for 10 years, looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," the guard said. But he didn't smile. He seemed to shrink back as Gideon approached the executive elevator bank. Gideon swiped his card again. Red light. Access denied. What the hell is wrong with the system today? He snapped at the guard. "Sir, I received an email this morning," the guard stammered. "From corporate security. Your access has been temporarily suspended." Gideon stared at him. Suspended. "On whose authority I am?" "Corporate security. I am this company." His phone buzzed. It was a notification for an urgent company-wide memo. He opened it, his blood running cold, as he read the subject line, "Announcement regarding executive leadership." The memo was brief, brutal, and corporate. Effective immediately, the board of directors has voted to place Gideon Thorne on an indefinite leave of absence. Rosalind Thorne has been appointed as interim chief executive officer. He read the words 3 times. They didn't make sense. It was a prank, a hack. It had to be. Rosalind, CEO. The woman who organized his dinner parties and picked out his ties. It was ludicrous. It was impossible. His phone rang. It was his personal banker. "Gideon, what's going on?" "We just got a directive from your CFO to freeze your corporate accounts and credit lines." Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced his armor of arrogance. He pushed past the stunned guard and took the public elevator. His mind racing. The board. Frank, Beatrice. They were his creatures, loyal to him. They wouldn't dare. When he burst onto the executive floor, the scene was one of controlled chaos. People were gathered in small, hushed groups, looking at him with wide, shocked eyes. His personal assistant, a woman he had hired right out of business school, wouldn't meet his gaze. He strode towards his corner office, the one with the panoramic view of the city. He was going to get to the bottom of this, and someone's head was going to roll. He pushed the double glass doors open. And there she was. Rosalind. She was not sitting in a visitor's chair. She was sitting in his chair behind his vast mahogany desk. She wasn't wearing a couture gown. She wore a simple, well-tailored navy blue maternity business dress. Her hair was pulled back in a severe professional bun. She looked up from a file she was reading. Her expression, not hateful, not triumphant, but utterly, terrifyingly calm. Rosalind. He breathed the name, a strange sound in this context. "What is this? What have you done?" "Good morning, Gideon," she said, her voice even. "I believe you've read the memo." The board felt a change in leadership was necessary to protect the interests of the shareholders. The board. "Frank and Beatrice work for me," he roared, taking a step into the room. "They work for the company," she corrected him gently. "And the company was at risk. You became a liability, an underperforming asset, you might say." She threw his own words back at him. He flinched as if she had slapped him. "This is insane," he hissed, his face turning a blotchy red. "You tricked them. You manipulated them. You're a housewife, not a CEO. You can't even run a board meeting." "I already have," she said, gesturing to the conference phone on the desk. "It was very productive. We passed the motion to place you on leave unanimously." He stared at her, the reality of the situation finally crashing down on him with the force of a physical blow. The humiliation from last night was nothing compared to this. This was annihilation. She had taken his kingdom. Why he whispered the rage, momentarily giving way to a raw, bewildered hurt. "I gave you everything." Rosalind stood up, her pregnant form a powerful silhouette against the city skyline. She walked around the desk until she was standing just a few feet from him. For the first time, he saw the deep, settled pain in her eyes, but it was overlaid with a resolve he had never seen before. "You didn't give me everything, Gideon," she said, her voice low and laced with the sorrow of 1,000 private disappointments. "You gave me things. You gave me a penthouse and cars and jewelry. But you never gave me your respect. You never saw me as a partner. Last night you stood up in front of all those people and you called me and your own child a regret, a mistake." She paused, letting the memory of his cruelty fill the space between them. "You taught me a valuable lesson, Gideon. You taught me that sentimentality is a weakness in business, that you have to be ruthless. So I am. I'm cutting away the fat. I'm protecting my asset." She placed a hand on her stomach. "My only asset that matters. This company is the best way to do that." "I'll fight this," he snarled, finding his anger again. "I will call the press. I will tell them you're an unstable, vindictive woman. I will destroy you." "Go ahead," she said with a small, sad smile. "But while you're talking to reporters, I'll be talking to the auditors from Arion AG. I'll be showing them the real balance sheets. I'll be the woman who is saving Thorn Industries from the fraudulent mess that its former CEO created. Who do you think they'll believe?" He had no answer. He looked into her eyes and saw not the soft, forgiving woman he had married, but a stranger, a queen who had seized his throne. He was utterly, completely defeated. "Security will be up in a moment to escort you from the building," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, a final flicker of the woman she used to be. "Please don't make a scene. It wouldn't be good for the stock price." She turned and walked back to the desk, sat down in his chair, and picked up the file again, dismissing him as if he were a junior analyst who had just been fired. He was no longer her problem. He was just a regret she was divesting from. Rosalind's first day as CEO was like walking into the heart of a storm. The moment Gideon was escorted out of the building, the executive floor erupted. Phones rang incessantly. VPs and department heads hovered outside her new office, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity, skepticism, and outright hostility. They were Gideon's people, his loyal lieutenants. To them, she was an imposter, a scorned wife staging a bizarre theatrical revenge. They were waiting for her to fail. She let them wait. For the first hour, she didn't speak to anyone. She had the IT department bring her a new secure laptop and spent the time on the phone with Frank Gable. "Frank," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "I want every financial document from the last 3 quarters on my desk. I want the unedited raw data, not the polished versions you prepared for the merger. I also want the complete personnel files of the entire executive committee. And schedule a call with the lead counsel for Arion AG for noon. Tell them it's a matter of urgent transparency." "Rosalind," the Arion lawyers, Frank stammered. "Are you sure if you reveal the liability?" "I am not going to reveal the liability, Frank." Not yet. I am going to introduce myself and establish a new tone. The tone of a company that has nothing to hide. It's called managing the narrative. Now please get it done." At 9:00 a.m., she walked into the main conference room. The entire executive team was there, a dozen men and one woman, all of them bristling with tension. They fell silent as she entered, their eyes raking over her, noting the pregnancy, the determined set of her jaw. She took her place not at the head of the table, Gideon's seat, but in the middle of one side, positioning herself as part of a team, not above it. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "I know you all have questions. I'm sure this transition is a shock. Let me be clear. This is not a personal matter. This is a corporate necessity. The board has lost confidence in Gideon's leadership and has tasked me with stabilizing the company and ensuring its future." A burly man with a thick neck, the head of operations, scoffed audibly. "Stabilizing? With all due respect, ma'am, what do you know about running a global tech conglomerate?" Rosalind met his gaze without flinching. "I know that Thorn Industries has a debt-to-equity ratio that is dangerously high, masked by off-balance sheet entities. I know that our R&D department is a year behind schedule on Project Chimera, our next-gen satellite network. But that progress reports have been falsified to keep the stock price inflated. And I know that our biggest subsidiary, Thorn Satellites, is carrying a hidden loss of nearly $900 million from the QS-7 launch failure, a loss that was intentionally concealed from our merger partners." The room went dead silent. Jaws literally dropped. She hadn't just entered the game. She'd just flipped the entire table over. She had shown them that she knew where every single body was buried. "This company is not stable," she continued, her voice ringing with authority. "It is a house of cards, and Gideon, in his arrogance, was about to light a match at the bottom. My job is to prevent it from burning to the ground. Your job is to help me." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each person. "I have your personnel files. I know who among you were architects of this deceit and who were merely following orders. I am not here to conduct a witch hunt. I am here to fix the problem. You have a choice. You can work with me transparently and honestly to save this company, or you can cling to your loyalty to the man who put a gun to all of our heads. If you choose the latter, your access will be revoked before lunchtime. Are there any questions?" There were no questions. The hostility in the room had been replaced by a grudging, fearful respect. She wasn't just Gideon's wife. She was a force to be reckoned with. For the rest of the day, Rosalind worked with a relentless, focused energy. She was a whirlwind of decisive action. She put Project Chimera on a temporary hold pending a full, honest review, a move that would cause a short-term stock dip but prevent a long-term catastrophe. She empowered the one woman on the executive team, the head of HR, to begin a quiet internal audit of the corporate culture, looking for the rot that Gideon's ego had fostered. Her call with the Arion AG lawyers was a masterclass in corporate diplomacy. She was charming but firm. She introduced herself as the new interim CEO appointed by the board to ensure a smooth and transparent final phase of the merger. She spoke of her commitment to synergy and shareholder value using the very language they understood. She didn't lie, but she controlled the flow of information completely. She hinted that she had uncovered some inefficiencies from the previous leadership that she was working to streamline for the health of the combined company. She left them feeling reassured, intrigued, and completely unaware of the bombshell she was sitting on. By late afternoon, the tide on the executive floor had turned. The whispers were no longer about the crazy wife, but about the Iron Lady. They saw her poring over financial statements, her brow furrowed in concentration. They heard her on calls, speaking with an authority they had only ever associated with Gideon. She wasn't just occupying the CEO's office, she was commanding it. Her biggest challenge came in the form of the head of engineering, a brilliant but abrasive man who was fiercely loyal to Gideon. He stormed into her office without knocking. "This is a farce," he declared. "Putting Chimera on hold will set us back 2 years." Gideon knew how to take risks. That's why he was a visionary. Rosalind didn't look up from her screen. Was it a risk or a lie? Dr. Alcott. Your own internal projections showed a 70% chance of catastrophic failure on the new guidance system, a failure you were told to bury. Was that part of the vision? Alcott froze his face, paling. Rosalind finally looked up at him, her gaze piercing. "I am not against taking risks. I am against taking stupid risks built on lies. Go back to your lab. I want a real projection, a real timeline, and a real budget on my desk by Monday. Show me a path to success that isn't paved with fraud, and I will give you every resource you need. Continue to lie to me, and you'll be updating your resume. The choice is yours." The engineer stared at her for a long moment, then turned and left. Without another word, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her new desk, Rosalind leaned back in her chair for the first time all day. She was exhausted, her body aching, but her mind was clearer than it had been in years. She had survived the first day. She had stared down the lions and had not been eaten. She placed a hand on her belly. The baby was quiet, as if sleeping peacefully. She had spent the day steering a corporate behemoth away from an iceberg. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. But as she looked out at the city lights twinkling to life, she knew with absolute certainty that she could do it. She wasn't just a placeholder. She was the hand on the tiller. And for the first time, the ship was sailing in the right direction. The weeks that followed were a war of narratives. Gideon predictably launched a vicious media campaign, feeding stories to tabloids that painted Rosalind as an unstable, vindictive wife. But while Gideon fought with slander, Rosalind fought with strategy. She ignored the gossip and focused on results. Her first move was a masterstroke of controlled transparency. She revealed the internal deception surrounding Project Chimera to a top financial journalist. The story immediately reframed her not as a scorned woman, but as a reformer cleaning house. Gideon's attacks suddenly looked like the desperate lies of a guilty man. Her true victory, however, was forged in a sterile boardroom in Berlin. Flying to meet the executives of Arion AG, she made a move of shocking audacity. She laid the full truth of Gideon's $900 million fraud on the table. Before they could sue, she presented a new offer, a restructured merger at a fairer price led by a CEO committed to transparency. They were stunned, then impressed. They saw not a liability, but a leader of immense integrity. The deal was saved, and her position as CEO was cemented not by blackmail, but by undeniable competence. The final confrontation with Gideon took place in the quiet of a lawyer's office to finalize their divorce. He was a shadow of his former self, his arrogance replaced by a hollow bitterness. "You learned my lessons too well," he rasped, looking at the settlement papers that would erase him from the company he built. "I taught you to be ruthless." Rosalind stood, her hand resting on her prominent belly. She looked at him not with hatred, but with a distant pity. No, Gideon. You didn't teach me to be ruthless. You taught me the difference between an asset and a person. You taught me what happens when you call a woman and her child a regret. She paused, her voice clear and final. You taught me everything I never want my child to be. Months later, Rosalind stood in her office, looking out at the city skyline. The company had a new name, one she had chosen. In her arms, she cradled her newborn daughter Hope. She had not just taken Gideon's empire. She had dismantled his toxic legacy and built a new one on its ruins. The world saw a sensational story of revenge, but Rosalind knew it was simpler than that. It was the story of a woman who was dismissed as a mistake and decided to become a monument instead, securing a future built not on lies, but on the unshakable foundation of her own strength. So what's the real takeaway from Rosalind Thorne's incredible story? It's a powerful reminder that the deepest betrayals can sometimes ignite our greatest strengths. She transformed a moment of profound humiliation into the catalyst for an empire. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming her narrative, her power, and securing a future for her child on her own terms. It proves that underestimating someone, especially someone you claim to love, can have catastrophic consequences. Rosalind's journey from a heartbroken wife to a powerhouse CEO shows us that the most formidable force in any room isn't necessarily the loudest or the richest, but the one with the quiet resolve to turn pain into power. If her story moved, you don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe for more true life stories of unbelievable twists and ultimate triumphs.